When did you hear the news?
I just woke up this morning, as you tend to do, and switched on the television, and there it was. I mean, he's 90 years old. It was not unexpected, but a shock all the same because of the finality of it, you know.
Yeah,
so, yes.
You said something to the effect that you're doing quite a few interviews. There's quite a bit of interest, apparently.
Well, the news broke here just early morning, so obviously there's a lot of breakfast media, radio and television. So it's an honour to talk about Sir George. It really is. You know, it's a funny thing because you end up being here, there, and everywhere when you're speaking about someone, and you don't wish to appear to be in any way capitalising on someone's death, and this I most certainly am not doing. But they need someone sensible to talk to, someone who isn't going to get the facts wrong. So it's my role in life, it seems, to be that person. So I have been on TV and radio this morning speaking about George.
Well, good on you. Good on you. Let me throw a couple of quick questions at you, okay?
Yes.
What made George Martin, Sir George, now the right guy to produce the Beatles?
George Martin was the right man to produce the Beatles because he was receptive to their points of view. They were always strong-willed, strong-minded individuals, the Beatles, and collectively even more so. And they needed someone who would actually listen to what it was they wanted and try to enable it in some way on tape. And at the same time, he needed to. Their producer had to be someone that they respected. It was a beautifully harmonious relationship from very soon after they met, when they really did tune into one another. And from that point on, there was no one better who could possibly have worked with them. And similarly, for George's perspective, no better artists for him to work with, because they had this combined, united quest to always look for something new and to move on from whatever they did last time. And they were a united fivesome in that respect, a perfect quintet in the studio.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, what do you think was his most important contribution? Not necessarily in terms of a particular track, but overall.
It's a hard one to measure, other than to say that whatever the producer's role was something that they kind of worked out between them. They didn't need an overbearing producer. They didn't need a producer who would bring his ego too strongly to the table. They needed someone who would actually facilitate the things they were hoping to achieve. So that is a massive achievement right there for George and the Beatles. They also just liked his personality. He was a very nice man to have around. He had a point of view, but he was, as I said, he was always able to listen to others' point of view. So he was extremely good company. They thought he was very funny. Indeed, he was very funny. So it just could not have been better. They were four of them, always, the Beatles, and when they closed ranks, it would exclude even the likes of George Martin. But undoubtedly, when it came to creating music, George Martin was the man that they wanted to do it with. And let's face it, this body of music that they worked on together is lasting forever. So what a legacy that is.
And they did go back to record with him for the final album for Abbey Road.
Yeah, towards the end of the Beatles' time together, they were, toying with the idea of working with other people, which was their right as creative people to try new things. But when they did do something without him, which was the Get Back, Let It Be project, for various reasons, not only George's less than hands-on involvement, it wasn't the happiest project. And when they decided that they would do one last album together, then there was only one man they were going to work with, and George Martin got the call. And Abbey Road is, of course, yet another triumph. It's a story of a great many triumphs.
Most definitely. Now, in terms of his musical performances with the group, my personal favorite is his piano solo for In My Life, but what do you think was his most important musical contribution to any particular track?
Well, obviously George Martin was a musician himself, and he could play piano, and certainly the piano on In My Life is a standout, because it's not only the fact that it's this beautiful piece of music and played it well, but it's the way he recorded it, playing it at half speed, and then running the take back at full speed, which actually changed the texture of the sound. He called it his wound up piano. You know, they were so keen to try different things, and he was the ideal man for that, because he said, well, listen to this, have you ever thought of doing this? And I mean, there's that quote of John Lennon saying where, you know, we want to go ooh, ooh, and ee, and George is saying, well, look chaps, you know, I've thought of this. And they say, great, let's put it on here. That is exactly a brilliant crystallization from John there, in that he came up with ideas they wouldn't have thought of themselves. But like I keep saying, we must keep this in perspective. They came up with things he wouldn't have thought of. This was a relationship of equals, and I think that's why it's so strong.
Most definitely. Now, you know, he had a huge legacy outside the Beatles, but both before and after. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I had the privilege of spending a few months back in about 2001 putting together a 6-CD box set of George Martin's 50-year career, produced by George Martin. 6 CDs, 158 tracks. And it spans, I think there's about 3 Beatles tracks on there, but the rest of them, a phenomenal a range of different musical pieces, from classical symphonies to jazz, to light classics, to little operettas, to certainly novelty and comedy records, which was what he was becoming known for in the UK before the Beatles came along. I hope that today, while George Martin is being remembered for his Beatles work, that people also talk about Goodness Gracious Me by Peter Sellers and Sophia Loren, that they talk about The Hole in the Ground by Bernard Cribbins, that they talk about From Russia with Love by Matt Monro, and Goldfinger by Shirley Bassey, and Live and Let Die for Paul McCartney, of course, the Bond theme. This man had an extraordinary career, working with all the greats, and one of the last things he ever did was the Candle in the Wind tribute to Princess Diana with Elton John, which became the biggest selling single record of all time. So George Martin had a phenomenal career of highs, but he was such a decent man all the way through it. Such a pleasure to work with.
Tell me about your personal relationship with him. How much contact did you have with him during that period, and what was he like to work with?
George Martin was always a very easy man to work with. He was interested in your opinions. He did want to know what you thought of something. He would take it on board, and it would ultimately filter into whatever his decision might be. We worked together on the Beatles anthology. We did the 3 double CDs, or he produced them, but I was kind of his advisor and assistant on it, which was obviously a great thrill to be at Abbey Road with him. I worked on a Sgt. Pepper TV show with him in 1992, a documentary. And then I did this box set of his 50-year career with his involvement. So I had many, many personal good times with George. The first time when I met my present wife, she came to the studio one day. She'd been in London, and I was working at Abbey Road with George. And I said to George at the end of the day, my wife's waiting for me in the reception area. And he said, oh, I'd love to come out and meet her. So she's just sitting there waiting for me. And suddenly Sir George, who was like 6'3", comes out with me to say hello to her and to welcome her, if you like, into the fold. And that was a very charming thing to do. He was a charming man who had time for people and made them feel good. It's the ultimate role of a producer, is to bring out the best of in the people who are around you, and that's what he did.
Well, that's a perfect segue, because I wanted to go back and talk just a little bit more about their working relationship, you know, because EMI and most producers of pop music in Britain at the time were were pretty staid. They were pretty much compartmentalized, and EMI was not considered a very experimental label. Yet Martin was, as you said, open to experimenting, and this group walked in that wasn't going to settle for just anything, and they did make a fantastic creative group, but the idea of that he kind of broke the mold as far as his fellow producers was concerned. It really intrigued me, because he was at the time he started working with the Beatles, he got a lot of flack from his peers and contemporaries in the engineering and producing world.
He was a maverick, and for a while, just before the Beatles came along, he was the youngest record producer in London. And that was crucial, because there was a tendency on the part of his colleagues and contemporaries to be, 10, 15, 20 years older, and therefore this was not their kind of music, rock and roll. Rock and roll wasn't George's kind of music either, but he was very cool to the idea of doing different things. Had they been with any other producer who would have imposed his point of view too strongly upon them, then the Beatles would have been hampered in the way that they were working. George Martin never cramped their style. He only ever brought the best out of them. They were incredibly lucky to have a man like that. More lucky than they ever realized, because the story of how George Martin came to sign the Beatles, which I tell in my book, Tune In, is one that makes you realize just on what slender threads our good fortunes all hang. Because he didn't really want to sign them either. He was kind of persuaded to sign them, hadn't even met them yet, and only after he had signed them did he realize just what he had in front of him. But his ability to enhance their music and not in any way impose himself upon it was vital.
Well, at the very outset when he signed them, he was a little bit, let's say, trying to reshape them in a bit. It was he who suggested that they jettison Pete Best, correct?
No, that's not quite right. What he said was, you can do anything you like with your drummer. It's your group. I won't interfere. But when you come to the recording studio, I won't use him. I will always have a session drummer in his place. Which is what actually record producers did quite routinely, especially once the group started to come in. The Beatles opened the floodgates to all, massive numbers of groups all getting into the recording studio, and many of them were better on stage than they were in the studio, where the deficiencies on stage were less apparent than they were once you put them down on tape. So that wasn't changing the Beatles. That was just saying to them, I won't use him when next time you come down. But since they were already thinking of getting rid of Pete, that was just like, well, now we will. But he was savvy enough to realize that they were a group and that one of them shouldn't be the leader. Not that they would have accepted such an imposition anyway, but he didn't even try it, George. Right. He just recognized that what he saw was all he needed to do. He saw in them what Brian Epstein saw, which was that if I make these people available to the public will like them. And certainly both men, the Beatles were incredibly fortunate to have Brian as their manager and George as their producer. And as I keep saying, they were fortunate to have the Beatles in their lives. We're talking here really about partnerships.
Definitely. Now, but, George did want them to record How Do You Do It at the very beginning, too. And I think the way that they kind of handled that, they kind of pushed back on that, gently, sort of, kind of told him that they were not really interested in doing other people's stuff, that they were really more interested in developing their own art and craft.
Yeah, they made their point of view clear to George. We will do this, but we really, really, really would rather you don't release it. And they had no real position to be making such a request. But the actual truth of the matter, because these things should be looked at from all angles, is that George didn't really listen to their requests so much as the demands of others that it not be issued, and that was why he ended up, in the Beatles' eyes, it appeared to them that he had listened to their request, don't release this. In fact, there were other reasons why that record did not come out at the time. But all that is nitpicking. The reality is that from the end of 1962 to the middle of 1970, the Beatles had the most brilliant working relationship with this man. And it was a working relationship that was extended into personal friendships as well. You know, he went on holiday, he and Judy went on holiday with John and Cynthia, for example. They were close. They were actually close, these people. They respected one another that much.
Well, that's a perfect way to wrap it up, but I have one question, and you know I got to ask, how's Volume 2 coming?
Well, Volume 2 is coming along fine, thank you. There's such a lot to do on it. The project just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, but it's coming along well. I'm researching constantly, finding great material constantly, and can't wait to sit and write it, and can't wait for people to read it, but it will take a while.
Very good, very good. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for your time. I appreciate it. I'll let you go. Do you have any parting shots? Any final word you'd like to pass on to American listeners?
I just want to say, I think I've kind of said it all already, but Sir George was a one of a kind. He was a gentleman and a scholar. He was brilliant at what he did. He was the enabler of the Beatles' talent to flower and develop in the recording studio. And he was not the fifth Beatle. I don't buy into any of his fifth Beatle stuff. But undoubtedly, in the studio, they were a five, and he was the fifth guy.
Well, thank you, my friend. Have a great day, and best to Anita, and we'll talk to you real soon.
Thanks, Stephen. All the best to you and Nadine.
Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.